welcome you all at the Paris School of Economics, and let me say how glad we are, Facundo Alvaredo, Lucas Chancel, Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zuckman, to be here. Let me say, this is the first Wid.world conference. This is the first presentation of World Inequality Report, but we very much hope that this is the first in a long sequence. And so thanks a lot all for being here. So what we're going to have in this conference, we're going to start right away with the presentation of the World Inequality Report 2018. I'm going to say a few words about the history of the project, and then I will leave the floor to Lucas Chancel, Lydia Aswad, and Clara Martinez, who will present a different part of the report. Then we'll have a break. Then we'll have another session in the morning, which will be shared by Emmanuel Saez, where we will have a discussion of the report by Esther Duflo, Branko Milanovic, Gabriel Zuckman will make a presentation, and we'll have a general discussion, and you will ask questions. Then after lunch, we will have, and tomorrow we will have a large number of sessions where literally dozens of research papers and dozens of countries will be presented on inequality in Latin America, to Asia, to North America, to Africa. I'm very grateful to all the researchers who have submitted papers for this conference. This way we tried to put as many as we could in the program, which is why we have sometimes 4 parallel sessions at the same time, which will make it difficult to attend all the fantastic presentations that will take place. So sorry about this. And this afternoon we will also have the session in honor of Tony Atkinson. So of course Tony should have been here today, and we are all very sad that he passed away in January. Tony was one of the co-founders of the World Top Income Database and World Inequality Lab, and he should have been here today. We are all very sad, and we will have a session this afternoon to talk more about Tony's legacy. So let me start right away with the presentation of the report. If this works. Yep. So this report is based on Wid.world, which is which tries to be the most extensive available database on the historical evolution of income and wealth inequality. Although, I should say, we still miss a lot, and this is, we know a little bit more than we used to, but we still know too little, and so it's not as if we are happy with the outcomes. This is just what we have at the present stage, and there are still many countries in many parts of the world, in particular in Africa, where we don't have proper access to the data we would like to access to in order to to reach a better coverage, and so we hope in the future we'll do more. But at this stage, this is what we have. Let me stress that this is really a very collective research program. This is something that could not have been done without the energy of dozens of researchers. Over 100 researchers covering more than 70 countries in the world have participated to this project. So this is really very collective. The other important feature of the project is to be 100% transparent. So, the report itself, the World Inequality Report, which you can access to in PDF format right away online, I think starting at 7 a.m. this morning, but something like this. But this is only 300 pages long. You have an executive summary that's 10 pages long. But behind the 300-page report, there are literally thousands of pages which we have put online, which all the country study, all the computer codes. You can reproduce all the computation so that people can improve our computation, and this is very much the objective, that people say, oh, on this particular country, now we have some new data, we are going to use it better, these are revised series. So this is very much a collaborative project with thousands of pages online so that everybody can reproduce and push it further. This is the first systematic assessment of globalization in terms of economic inequality. Probably, let me say right away, one of the most important results we come from is that despite high growth in emerging countries, so despite the reduction in between country inequality, we have a global rise in inequality, which means that the forces in terms of rise in within country inequality are structurally stronger than the forces in terms of reduction in between country inequality. And one way to see it is that the global top 1% has increased a lot faster than the bottom 50% of the world population. And in fact, in terms of share of global income growth, their share in global income growth is roughly twice as much or even a bit more than twice as much than the share captured by the bottom 50%. Now, the good news is that it's possible to do something about it. Okay, so this is not a pessimistic report saying, okay, globalization leads to inequalities, this is very sad, and we should all cry. This is not the conclusion. The conclusion is that different policy can lead to different outcomes. And indeed, we see a lot of divergence in country experience. So you have a general pattern of rising inequality, but with very different magnitude across different regions in the world. If you look at US vis-à-vis Europe, China vis-à-vis India. And when you make this comparison, what you see is that there are some countries which have, at the same time, less rise in inequality and more growth, typically China and India, but you can take lots of other examples. And we can learn from these experiences about the policies that help to promote more equitable growth. And ultimately, this is our objective, is to from this diverse set of experience, to learn about how to conduct a better globalization. Okay. So this is very much what we are doing. So let me talk a little bit about the history of the project. So we are trying, I will cover the part one of the report, which is about the history of the project. The objective, as I already said, is really to fill a democratic gap, to equip various actors of society with the necessary knowledge to intervene in the debate. So we are mostly, a data-driven enterprise. We try to draw conclusion at the very end of the report, and we try to describe what we view as the most reasonable conclusion from our findings, but we don't ask everybody to agree with our interpretation. Our first objective is just to provide the data so that others can use it, make their own opinion, use it for subsequent research, and this is really our primary goal as a data provider. Why do we think this is important? Well, because international organization and international statistical institute still don't do it inequality measurement, don't do inequality measurement as much as they should, and maybe at some point in the future they will do it, and we will be very happy to give it over to them. But at this stage, I think there is room for academics to promote better knowledge of inequality. So this is really a collective research project, and we are very much in the continuation of a very long-term collective research agenda. In a way, the two sort of founding fathers of what we do are Simon Kuznets and Tony Atkinson. So Simon Kuznets was the first economist to construct long-run series on inequality in the 1950s. So as you all know, he was the first one to measure national income and GDP in the US, and also to use the income tax data coming from the federal income tax that had been created in 1913 in the US. He used the data from 1913 to 1948. This was the first time ever a series on inequality and what share of total growth going to the top 10%, the bottom 90%. So he was the inventor of GDP, but he also tried to go beyond GDP by trying to see what share of GDP growth the different social groups are getting. Tony, of course, played a key role in the 1970s, 1980s, and we will talk more about Tony Atkinson's legacy this afternoon in the special session. But let me in particular say that in his 1978 book with Harrison, he used historical data on wealth inequality in Britain, very much in the same way than Kuznets in the 1950s for income in the US, but in a way, in a manner that is more directly linked to testing economic mechanism and drawing policy conclusions than Kuznets. Now, we started with similar series as Kuznets for France, which I first worked on in 2001. Then, with Emmanuel Saez, we covered the case of the US. Then Tony Atkinson, with his incredible energy, pushed us in the direction of covering dozens of countries. We published two books, two big volumes in 2007, 2010, covering more than 30 countries. In 2011, at the Paris School of Economics, right here, we launched the first version of the World Top Income Database. So this was in January 2011, so almost 7 years ago. And with Tony, we had a conference to launch the first version of the World Top Income Database. Now, gradually this has been extending to more and more countries and to wealth rather than simply income inequality. The new website, Wid.world, was launched in January 2017. So this is the outcome of a very big collaborative effort, in particular with the help of Lucas Chancel. The key novelty today, I would say, there are three major extensions that are underway right now. Probably the most important extension is the better coverage of emerging countries. Until now, we had relatively good series for top income shares, bottom income shares to some extent in the US, in Europe, but one of the big gap, in particular one of the big limitations in my book, Capital in the 21st Century, among many other limitations, is that it's very much centered on developed countries. Okay, too little data on emerging countries, developing countries. This was not entirely my fault. This is because of difficulties to access the data. Now, one of the good impacts of the success of the book and the debate on inequality is that in some cases it helped us to push access to better data in Brazil, in Korea, in India, in China, in Russia, and now we are able to have better coverage of the world. So this is probably the most important innovation, and Luca will tell you about this more in a minute. Second innovation, we try to cover as much as we can the entire distribution from bottom income shares to top income shares. One of the limitations of our previous work and one of the criticisms that was made to us was that it was too centered on top income shares. And so we take criticism seriously. It takes us time to respond because this is a lot of work, a lot of data collection, but at the end we try to come with answers. And in particular now for the US, for France, and for a rising number of countries, we have what we call distributional national accounts, where we try to cover the entire distribution from the bottom to the top, before tax, after tax, income, and wealth. So this is still an ongoing process. This will take a long time before we can cover all countries as much as we would like to, but this is going on. Now, the third important addition is that we try to cover wealth, and not only income, which means also a better coverage of offshore wealth, and this is an area in which the contribution of Gabriel Zuckman have been absolutely essential, and Gabriel will tell you more about this a bit later. So this is a constantly extending database. Right now we have income shares for about 70 countries. We have wealth income ratio and wealth distribution for about 25 countries. This is extending, but it's more difficult to get proper wealth data than income data. We have macro data on net national income for about 180 countries. The data website is available now in Chinese, English, French, and Spanish. So more than 3 billion people can access it in their own language. We also have technical tools available online which can be used by researchers and journalists and anybody who wants to make progress in our understanding of inequality data. So this is the website which you can have a look at, where all the data will be put online. I should say that we will constantly have new countries that we will put online. So last week we put some new series on inequality in Poland, which is not in the report because it was not available in time for the report, but it's already online. So it will, the report is just a photography of what we had at a given point in time, but this is not the final point of the process. So let me now stop there and leave the floor to Luca for the presentation of the main findings of the report. And Luca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I will now present the second part of the World Inequality Report, which is entitled Global Income Inequality Dynamics. And the first point that I would like to stress is that as soon as we moved not only from the study of the top income shares, but also to the analysis of the distribution within the bottom 99%, so the low income group, the middle classes, and as soon as we focus not only on rich countries, but also on emerging countries, then we have enough detailed inequality data to produce a global income distribution. And this is what I will present now. There are three key results in this second part of the report. The first one is that the top 1% captured twice as much growth as the bottom 50% combined since 1980. The second result is that despite growing despite high growth rate in the emerging world, we observe rising income inequality at the level of the world. So the top 1% captures today a higher share of global income than in 1980. Now, as Thomas said before, the picture is not that dark or that bleak. There is optimism in the sense that there are very different national trajectories in the face of the large trends that countries face since 1980. And we observed rising inequality, but in nearly all countries, but at different speeds, which highlights the importance of policy and of institutions to tackle or to moderate the rise in inequality. So I will go step by step through these different points, starting with how do we construct our inequality statistics. Well, so official statistics do not provide an adequate picture of global inequality today. Why? Well, because essentially they are based on household surveys, and household surveys misreport and generally underreport incomes at the top of the distribution, leading to generally lower inequality estimates, or at least the estimates that come out of these official statistics do not properly track the dynamics at the top of the distribution, precisely where a lot of action has been taking place over the past decades. So what we do at Wid.world is that we combine tax data with survey data, with national accounts data in a systematic manner and in the most transparent possible way, so that all our assumptions can be visible, can be reproduced, or can be modified online for researchers or the general public willing to do so. And we aim to then put this national level detailed data together, and we proceed step by step. That is, we aggregate countries together in our production of a global distribution of income and or wealth when we are confident enough with the level of detail and the precision of our estimates. So I will show later in this presentation that for wealth inequality, for instance, we aggregate much less country than for income, because so far we feel that there's still much more left work to do in the case of wealth inequality. All right, so we follow this step-by-step approach. And our results, at least on income inequality, confirm the now relatively well-known elephant curve of global inequality dynamics. And here, a reference to Branko Milanovic sitting here and Chris Lackner. We confirm and amplify this result with a more systematic approach using tax data and a larger country coverage. So here are the building bricks of our global income distribution, with novel work that has been done at Wid.world on the distributional national account. So that is, we distribute national income in all these countries to the entire population from the bottom to the top in a way that is comparable across countries. And we now have China, large European countries, USA, India, Russia, Brazil, the Middle East, on which we will have a focus in a few minutes by Lydia Aswad. And we bring these together to produce our global distribution. At the moment, we cover 75% of global income with detailed data, so we still have to make some assumptions on how to distribute 25% of remaining national income. And we assume that the distribution of income in these remaining 25% of national income follows a similar trajectory, similar levels as in neighboring countries. Now we make several different assumptions, and we show in the report and in the technical appendix that this has very little impact on the general results that I will present in the coming slides. So let's have a snapshot of these building bricks of our income distribution. So here is the inequality level as measured by the share of income captured by the top 10%. In large regions or countries, from Europe on the left, the most equal region in this set of countries with a top 10 share of 37%. The Middle East on the right-hand side of the graph with a top 10 share of 61%. And we see the diversity of levels of inequality: China 41%, USA, Canada 47%, or India 55%. So this is the snapshot in 2016. Now, where do we come from? So here we start in 1980, and we see that in all these regions, there is a rise in inequality. However, this rise happened at very different speeds and very different rhythms. Take the case of Russia, for instance, where we see that it was the most equal country at the beginning of the period, and in a very short time span of around 5 years, it became the most unequal country in this set of regions and of countries. Now we have very progressive and important evolutions of inequality in India or in the USA, and a more moderate evolution in China and in Europe. If we take a more historical perspective to these evolutions, we see that 1980 is the end point of a low inequality period in these regions, which was indeed the result of very different political, social, economic transformations, but which led to the concentration of income and of wealth in all these regions. So now the question is, from this low inequality point, there is a rise of inequality. Where will it lead to? Well, we add here 3 regions. At the top of the graph, you see that we've just added Middle East, Brazil, and Sub-Saharan Africa. In these 3 regions, we see a relative stabilization of the top 10% income share at levels that seem to be so high that it is hard to actually go even higher in terms of inequality. Now the question is whether our regions which experience this more compression of income from the 1950s to the 1980s are going towards these extreme levels of inequality to the world inequality frontier, as we have called them in the report. Okay, so here we have looked at the building bricks of our global income distribution. Let us now look at the distribution of income among all world individuals. So this is what we do on this graph, the so-called elephant curve of global inequality and growth, where we represent on the x-axis the world population, so from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. We give each group of income of equal population size an equal space on the x-axis. So this is scaled by population size. Now what we represent on the y-axis is the real income growth rate per adult of each of these groups. What do we see? We see high income growth rate at the bottom of the global income distribution. So above 100%, this is the rise of emerging countries. Then we see in the middle and in the top tier of the distribution, the squeezed bottom 90% in the USA and in Western Europe, with growth rates that are lower than 50% and even near zero in some countries, like in the USA. And then we go to the right of the curve, we see the prosperity of the global 1% with growth rates that are higher than 200%. Now one may wonder, in fact, the right-hand side of this curve, does it really matter? In fact, it's just a small fraction of the world population. So perhaps the income that this group was, the total income growth that this group was able to capture doesn't necessarily mean much in terms of global growth. So we answer this question with this other representation. It's the same data, it's just represented in a different way. So now instead of scaling population, instead of scaling individual on a population scale, we give each group a share, we give it a length that is proportional to the share of global income growth captured over the period. So in the previous graph, the top 1% represented just 1 dot. Now it represents 27% of our axis because it captured 27% of total growth. If we look at the bottom 50%, which is by definition 50%, half of the world population, now it represents only 12% of the axis because it only captured 12% of total growth. So there is a massive inequality in how new growth was distributed among the world population over this period. So this is the first way to answer this question. Did it matter, this growth at the top? Yes, it mattered, and it mattered very much in terms of global growth. So instead of having these two representations and of playing with these two representations, we adopt in the report a mixed representation of the two previous graphs, because squeezing completely to the left half of the world population, squeezing it completely to the left of the graph is not necessarily the best way to represent what is happening here. So we prefer to give them a relatively important size, but we also stretch the right-hand side of the graph so as to be better able to represent the dynamics of income at the top of the global distribution. So this is what we do in this graph. Where does this graph come from, and how did we produce it? Well, in fact, it comes from the addition of two graphs. Of two cobras, let's say. The first graph is the, so to say, cobra of income growth and inequality in the Western world, where we see, we don't see the humpbacked shape on the left-hand side of the axis. So here we aggregate US, Canada, and Western Europe, and we plot again the real income growth per adult of our different groups of individuals, and we see that there is a relatively low and stable income growth rate up to the 20% richest individuals, and then from percentile 90 and 91, so 10% or top 1% onwards, the growth rate go very high, up to around 400%. So this is the cobra of income inequality and growth in the Western world. Now I'll show you another cobra, which is the cobra of income inequality and growth in China and India, in the emerging world. Very similar picture, except look at the y-axis. We had 400% before, now it's 4,000%, so reflecting the very high, very important growth rate in these regions. And again, we have a very high growth as compared to the rest of the distribution at the top. Now we see that growth has been less unequal in this region, in the sense that the top 1% captured 18% of total growth, whereas before it was 28% in the rich world. Now, our global elephant is the addition of these two cobras, of the high-income cobra and of the low-income cobra. And here we merge together China, India, Europe, and USA, Canada together. Just these 4 sets of regions. And we have this very neat, this very clear picture of the low-income growth rate around percentile 60 to 99, and very high income growth rate at on the first left-hand side part of the graph. Now, in the report, we have distributed growth in other countries, in countries where growth was lower than in China, for instance, in Africa, in Latin America, and this is why we have this picture of lower growth rate, lower growth rate at the bottom of the distribution. So if I compare the two elephants here. So this is our key result. The top 1% captured 27% of total growth. Now, another key question. Are we sure that the enormous rise of the global 1% over the period was necessary for the growth of the bottom? Well, the answer is no. Because when we have a careful analysis of country-level growth and inequality trajectories, well, this suggests that it was, in fact, possible to combine higher growth with lower inequality. And I will now compare Europe with the USA to discuss this claim, and India and China. When we look at Europe and the USA, we see a huge rise of inequality in the USA, but a complete stagnation of income at the bottom. When you look at India versus China, we see an extreme rise of inequality in India, but much higher growth in China than in India. So here is the comparison of Western Europe and the US, two regions which are broadly similar in terms of size, in terms of development level, and we see the very diverging trajectories followed by these two regions. Here we plot the top 1% income share in red, in the US on the left, versus the bottom 50% income share, and we see the complete inversion of the relative positions of these two groups in the US. The top 1% income share increased from 10% in 1980 to 20% today. In Europe, the top 1% income share, in Western Europe, it increased from around 10% to around 12% over the period, so rise in inequality, but much lesser than in the USA. Now let's make the same comparison with China and India. So here is a similar graph with the bottom 50% in blue and the top 1% in red, in China on the left and in India on the right, from 1980 to 2015. And we see that, again, in both cases, there's a rise of the top 1%, a decrease of the bottom 50%, but that in the case of China, this rise was stopped and there was a stabilization of inequality from the mid-2000 onwards, whereas in India, inequality continued to rise over the period. So these comparisons of regional blocks of similar size is interesting because in the case of Europe and the US, we have similar exposure to globalization or to new technologies. So this allows to have an answer to the question, was it new technology that triggered growth? Was it globalization that triggered growth? Well, we see a similar exposure to international market or to new technology. So why were there radically diverging inequality trajectories? Well, in fact, there were very different trajectories in policies and in institutional change in these two regions, with a much faster decline in progressive taxation in the US, very unequal access to education, falling minimum wage in the US, that were extremely important, that were not witnessed in Europe. Now, if we look at the growth rate, the actual growth rate of these different income groups versus the average, in the US, average income grew by 63% over the period in total. And the bottom 50% grew by 5% over the period. Let's compare this to Europe. Average income growth grew by 40%. So we also see here that it was not splendid. It was not exceptional. It was, in fact, slightly lower than in the US. But the bottom 50% grew by 26%. So better than in the USA, but not perfect either. Now let us compare China and India over the same period with their growth rates. In China, average income grew by more than 800% over the period. The bottom 50% by more than 400%. Extreme growth for the bottom 50% in China, but half that of the average. In China, average income grew by 200%, a bit more than 200%, whereas the bottom 50% by 100% only. Why were there such high differences in growth rate at the bottom? Well, this is largely due to the fact that there were much higher investments in education, in infrastructure, in social services for the poor in China that contributed to lifting their the growth rate of the bottom 50% and of the economy as a whole. Now let's do just one simple note here. All countries agreed in 2015 to the Sustainable Development Goals. And goal 10.1 of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations is that the bottom 40% should grow at a rate that is higher than the average. So here what we compare is the bottom 50%, but it was the same result for the bottom 40%. In none of these regions this target was met. Let us now move on to another result of the World Inequality Report, and this result is the deformation, the changing shape of the geographical breakdown of global income groups over the past decades. So here we scale our world population according to ascending income order from the left to the right, and in each income group we show the fraction of people, of individuals coming from different world regions. So we see that in 1990, the red area corresponding to China, or the yellow area corresponding to India, are very much on the left-hand side of the graph, whereas the blue area, the green area, so Europe, US, Canada, are highly represented at the top. So the top 1% here is everything that is on the right-hand side on the vertical red dotted line. What is the situation today? Well, we see this important deformation as we expect, with countries that are now stretched all across the global income spectrum. In China, for instance, very highly represented at the very top, so the coexistence of extreme rich with extreme poor in the same country. This is also the case in India, though at a lesser rate. And in certain countries, there is still a permanence of a lot of representation of individuals within the top 1%, US, Canada, still fairly well represented. And also, let's focus one moment on the gray area, which is the Middle East. Now, this connects to the previous points we were making on official data. In official surveys, we would almost barely see this gray area because the very rich of the Middle East are barely visible in income surveys. And this links to the first focus of this presentation by Lydia Aswad, which will detail the inequality data and the analysis that we make in the World Inequality Report on the Middle East.